It was clear already before the NATO summit in Vilnius that the door was not open to Ukraine to join the alliance anytime soon. But at least it's clearer now what Ukraine can expect as the U.S. and its allies unveiled new security assurances designed to bolster Ukraine against Russia. Ukraine is disappointed its aspirations of NATO membership is off the cards for now. But President Zelensky welcomed what he called a meaningful success and a significant victory for Ukraine. But as the war continues in Ukraine, the shape of the future remains quite uncertain. And that's where U.S. President Biden stepped in, laying out his vision for the future.
The defense of freedom is not the work of a day or a year. It's the calling of our lifetime. Of all time. We are steeled for the struggle ahead. Our unity will not falter, I promise you. Folks, as I look around the world today at a moment of war and peril, a moment of competition and uncertainty, I also see a moment of unprecedented opportunity. Unprecedented opportunity. Opportunity to make real strides toward a world of greater peace and greater prosperity, liberty and dignity, equal justice under the law, human rights and fundamental freedoms, which are the blessing and birthright of all of humanity. That is the world the United States is working toward. And it's one we'll only reach if we do it together. And I mean together. We need to take the same spirit of unity, common purpose, determination that we have demonstrated in our response to Russian aggression in Ukraine and bring more partners along as we continue working to build a world we want to live in and a world we want for our children.
For more on this, we can now speak to Raphael Bossong from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Welcome. What's your biggest takeaway from Biden's speech today?
Well, I think the speech was just to round off, like to sort of reassure people. And as you already sort of shown, the main message is, of course, we don't waver. So, well, we'll see what happens in 24 when the next American elections are. But as long as he's in charge, America stays the course. And I think that's the main message.
Ukraine has not been offered membership, and it's widely believed that the U.S. as well as Germany are the major players standing in the way of that. But they're also Ukraine's biggest providers of aid. So what's the logic behind this?
Well, the official argument is that, the aid is what matters now. I mean, the offensive is going on right now, and everybody agrees that Ukraine can't join while the war is going on. So drawing that war to most successful conclusion, what's possible, that's the priority now. So that's the official line. Of course, behind that, the U.S. is ultimately really calling the shots. I don't want to kind of pull Germany out of the line of critique or responsibility, but really, ultimately, it's up for the U.S. to say when and how they're ready to take up this credible commitment for actually really standing up, ultimately also with this nuclear arsenal for the defense of Ukraine. So that's something I can understand is not taken lightly. While other military aid is flowing in.
So is it fair to say that the national interests of the United States and Germany align in this case, or is the motivation a different one?
They align. I mean, every country has obviously a different perspective, and I think the American decision, while taking from further afar and obviously having a different relationship to Russia than Germany, is in the way ultimately more weighty and sort of important. But yes, I mean, I don't think that Germany, of course, has a very important voice here, but Scholz has been saying for months and months, and to the annoying many people, that it's all in conjunction with other allies and following. And I think in this case, also the US wasn't too unhappy that they had one backer and that not everybody would point at the US saying they are dragging their feet.
Now that you bring up Chancellor Scholz, let's listen to some of what he said today.
We have taken very good decisions regarding Ukraine. In the documents that NATO has agreed on here, that can be seen in various aspects. First, we did it unanimously. Secondly, the Ukrainian president praised the overall decisions taken here today. And it's also quite clear the question of NATO membership will not be an issue that is subject to negotiation for those who are not part of this partnership. Russia will not take part in these negotiations. I think that's very clear.
All right, so let's unpack this because there's a lot to unpack. Isn't it a little disingenuous of him to say that Ukraine left the summit happy when just a day ago this man, Volodymyr Zelensky, was venting on Twitter saying that it's absurd how NATO is behaving?
Well, I mean, this is diplomacy. I mean, we also know that the Ukrainian government and Zelensky are, well, getting results by being pushy, but then there was a bit of a pushback just the last day and a half. And now they're obviously all sides are signaling we're on the same page after all. So this is not a serious rift that we have seeing here. But of course, yes, Ukraine would have been happier if there had been a clear timetable and some more like really bold steps than that we've seen now. But at the same time, of course, and this was expected, this commitment by the G7 is significant, and hopefully this broad outline and the promise of bilateral, more concrete commitments will be fleshed out in the coming days.
Then let's look at what he said about Russia, that Russia is not part of the negotiation of whether or not Ukraine can join NATO. But isn't the reality that the fact that Ukraine cannot join NATO very much depends on what Russia is doing right now?
Yeah, and I mean, the whole war, at least in Russian argument, is that, well, we started this because we didn't want Ukraine to join.
Exactly.
And Ukraine was already in line in 2008 and wasn't joining because of Russian, well, red lines, supposedly. So, of course, Russia is part of the equation. I think, well, one can interpret a lot in this kind of statement, but the critical question is, and there has been suspicion that there weren't, the US and also Germany were more hesitant because they wanted to keep this as a bargaining chip once there was a ceasefire. And this is signaling, well, no, we don't think about it in these terms. Whether this will actually hold up, of course, will be shown when it comes to it.
Messaging, exactly.
But this is the subtext here.
What do you make of the official messaging and the interpretation that this might be a bargaining chip? And Ukraine is, of course, not happy about the position it finds itself in that.
Well, Zelensky said something else, saying it's clear no territory is up for being traded. I don't know his literal words, it was translated from Ukrainian, but basically saying if there's one village with one person living in it, we're not ready to trade it for anything. And so I think this was the counter pitch in a say to say we're, of course, principally open to negotiation, but we are not ready to be sold out in terms of territory. He didn't speak explicitly about NATO. NATO said Ukraine's future is in NATO. So it's also a statement. It's not something to lightly. But the pacing and the speed, yes, that is up for negotiation. And I think in that sense, well, yes, Russia remains a part of the equation, to be fair.
Let's talk about the temperature here in Germany. How much longer can Germany keep up its support for Ukraine when maybe the war is seen as a more destabilizing element than the threat posed by Russia to Germany directly?
Well, I think the public support is still pretty strong. I mean, there are, of course, always competing demands, public spending, et cetera, but this earlier worry that really public support would crumble, that there would be a winter of discontent, et cetera, this is really off the table. And I think in that sense, we can really count on Germany staying the course. There is, of course, always disagreement among various politicians and parties on how much and how fast, and many people would have taken a more bold step, and Scholz is his usual self, trying to be the calm, I'm in control, but, you know, being a bit more cautious type. But I think overall this is pretty clear, and the bigger question really is, ultimately, hopefully the US will stay on course next year. And I think there are good reasons to think so. There are also many Republicans who want to stay the course. But yes, this is really the big factor. Will the next US presidential election be just a bump in the road, or will this really throw everything into question again?
Raphael Grossam from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
Let's dig a little deeper and bring in Rachel Rizzo. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. She joins us from Vilnius. Welcome to the program. That was quite an energetic speech from Biden, wasn't it? What did you make of it?
It was. I mean, I think what he said was very clear, and the message that he wanted to send was exactly what he said, that they are going to stand with Ukraine for liberty, for freedom, for as long as it takes. I think a lot of people weren't really sure what to expect when Biden got onto stage, maybe talking just about NATO, about the importance of the U.S.-European alliance. But as you heard, it went far, far further than that. He talked not just about Ukraine, but also about the safety of the world order in general.
From everything we have heard at the summit and leading up to the summit, would you say NATO allies are serious about bringing Ukraine into the fold someday in an undefined future?
I think someday in an undefined future is sort of the key phrase there. I think Zelensky wanted more than he got from this NATO summit here in Vilnius. He wanted not just the promise that Ukraine will eventually join, but he wanted a clear timeline. He wanted more than NATO gave Ukraine back in 2008, where they made a similar promise saying that Ukraine would eventually join, but gave them no clear pathway as to how or when. But this promise this time comes along with much stronger security guarantees, economic guarantees, and the promise of long-term security promises. So that is all good news for him. So I think both sides can walk away happy.
Does NATO plan on extending a formal invitation to Ukraine at some point, though? Why is it so hard to define a timeline for a future after the war?
So as many people have mentioned, bringing Ukraine into NATO right now is a no-go because of Article 5, which is the alliance's mutual security guarantee. It basically would create a scenario where NATO brings itself into the war. So
but that's also not what Ukraine is asking for. Ukraine is always talking about a scenario where this war has ended.
Exactly. So if the war ends and we're looking, say, 5 or 10 years down the road and Ukraine does get an invitation to NATO and say Russia invaded again, then NATO allies would be obligated by treaty at that point to go to war with and alongside Ukraine. And I think that is still perhaps a difficult pill for many NATO allies to swallow. Obviously, Poland and the Baltics, they see this as existential. They want Ukraine in NATO as soon as the war ends. As we saw from this summit, Germany and the U.S. are still a little bit timid as to a promise of an exact timeline. This is a consensus alliance. All 31, hopefully soon to be 32 members with Sweden have to guarantee to big decisions like this.
Did you see any missed opportunities at this summit?
So I think that there are some missed opportunities, maybe for those who were really, really pushing for stronger language. You know, when you come out with communiques from a summit like this, you sort of have to agree upon lowest common denominator language. And that's why a lot of the communiques that come out can seem a little bit watered down. And really the meat of the security guarantees, especially for Ukraine, is found in other statements like the G7, like the things that different bilateral countries have said. And so the missed opportunity, I think, it could potentially be for a clear timeline. But again, these are very, very difficult things to get 31 allies to agree on. So you know, the 75th anniversary summit will be in Washington next year. Let's just see what happens then.
All right. Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council, thank you for your analysis.
Thank you.